And of course, this is a way of just connecting to our intuition. Archetypes are almost like lenses or magnifying glasses. And when we connect to them in a personified way, it takes us out of the abstract, it takes us out of the theoretical, and then we can kind of go into that lens or portal and let the wisdom of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years of our subconscious human experience come to us. And that, of course, is the perennial power of archetypes, is that they connect us to the deep unconscious, the deep personal unconscious, but also the deep collective unconscious. And of course, that is what spirituality and religion really is. It's a way to connect us to a collective unconscious through a personal experience. And in some religions, that has kind of been used for mind control and has kind of been, used to create cohesion in society, often to the detriment of personal growth. But this path of initiation, this path of the mysteries, is the exact opposite of that. This is very much about developing our own personal relationship with the divine. And that takes us back to the ancient Greek saying, know thyself, gnothi seoton, which was kind of one of the tenets of the classical world. The only way to know God, goddess, is to know ourselves. And that doesn't make us the God or the ego, the principal ego in our world. It's more a journey of understanding how we interact with the godliness of the world out there, be that the physical world, be that the celestial world, or be that through our process of transformation in the underworld, again, obviously symbolically speaking. So it's understanding, knowing how we react in certain situations, knowing ourselves enough to understand what are good practices for us and which practices don't work for us. Conventional religions often give a sort of a one-size-fits-all answer to things, and it doesn't always fit all. And in some religions, like Hinduism or so-called paganism, polytheism, the beauty of having many divinities, for example, is that one can be devoted to a divinity that resonates with what you need in your life at this time or in general. And one of the aspects of archetypes that is so beautiful and fascinating is this twofold path with archetypes. I believe that in our lives we have one or two principal archetypes that kind of embody us, or that we embody, that kind of represent our basic essence. It's like what we do, what we love, what we want to experience in this world. And of course, it's not the same for everyone. We've all got our facets, but we've got one or two principal sort of archetypes. And then we can call in other archetypes, other forces into our lives when we need them. We can, if we want to open ourselves to love and relationships, we might call on Hera or Aphrodite to help open our heart, for example, or to help just bring in the magic of, let's say, attracting a relationship or transforming a relationship. And these sort of temporary archetypes or these secondary archetypes might, come and go in our lives, depending on the phases and when we need these. And that, of course, is, in polytheistic religions, people go to temples and make offerings to these gods when they need certain things, when they need help in certain ways. And especially in Hinduism as well, people also feel, even though there's a certain pantheon, people feel that they are devotees of certain gods or goddesses, and that is where they put their main focus. And the other aspect of archetypes, of course, is that on the one hand, they represent who we are in essence, and that can have positive and negative expressions. So the journey of understanding archetypes and our own relationship to archetypes is observing where we have a negative expression, where we have a positive expression, and then finding the ways to balance that. So it becomes proactive as well. It's not just about praying and begging for divine intervention. It's actually, what is the course? What is the path that we can follow in order to become better people? And just a very simple, but I think a very good example of this is the god Dionysos, or Bacchus, of the Greek pantheon. And Bacchus is commonly known as the god of wine and inebriation, which I believe is a dumbed down perspective of what Dionysus represents. But now Dionysus in the modern world is a very good example of how we've kind of lost ourselves in the West, in modern Western society. The god Dionysus can be the god of ecstatic states and of ecstatic rebirth. Dionysus is very much the same as Christ. That's actually Dionysus there behind me. Dionysus is also very similar to Christ, and the early mysteries, the language used to describe Dionysus was very much the same language used to describe Christ. Those principles of salvation, of redemption, of revelation, all came from Dionysus in the classic world. Those words are also used with regards to Christ in Christianity. But what we see in the modern world is kind of an abuse of Dionysus, and that we see in alcohol abuse, drug abuse, etc. So that is an example of how, let's say, a society that, at least in theory, was geared towards the ecstasy of rebirth and transformation of Christ in a Christian society, which is, by extension still Dionysian, how that has, the negative side of that has been expressed, and especially in generations with drug abuse and with kind of a loss of ecstasy and a loss of vision in younger people in many cases. So in this example, what we need in the West, possibly, is to move away from the negative use of, let's say, substances, the abuse of them, the using them in non-sacred ways, and for there to be a return to ecstasy. And there's really an upsurge in psychedelic therapy and psychedelic spirituality at this time as well, which is almost like a counterbalance. And that is very much an indication of people returning to what the true, let's say, Dionysius energy is in our lives or in society. Also the fact of, people, we as humans love stories. That is why movies and books are so popular. That is why social media is so popular, because we're kind of looking at the stories or narratives of others. And that is also kind of a form of positive escape, which is, again, relates to Dionysius, and that need for myth and that need to get out of the ego to have ecstasy. And the word ecstasy means, it comes from the Greek ekstasis, which means to stand outside yourself. And this, of course, is important because we'll talk about this with the breathwork later. But when we stand outside of ourselves, we can look back on ourselves. We can stand outside of the ego and we can see ourselves better. But we can also see God better. We can also see the divine better, so that we can have a broader perspective. So ecstasy isn't, in modern usage, ecstasy tends to relate maybe to sexuality, for example. And of course, sacred sexuality or any sexuality is also ecstatic. It also takes us out of ourselves, allows us to commune not only with another person, but also with kind of, divine ecstasy. So Dionysius is kind of all of those things, but many of those aspects are taboo. Certainly in the West through Christianity, etc. Inebriation or ecstasy or psychedelics was seen as a bad thing and had to be suppressed. When it was suppressed, people started to find other ways to use it. The same goes with sexuality. It was suppressed and pushed down and made sinful, and therefore kind of, let's say, perverted expressions or sort of repressed expressions of sexuality came to be common. So this takes us into one of, I guess, the big problems of where we are as a modern society, which is our crisis of belief. We in the West, we are kind of in a post-Christian phase, in a way also like a post-scientific phase. Christianity was of course dominated Western society up until the Second World War. But already in the 19th century, science started to become more prevalent. It started to change the worldview to a very large degree. And what has happened is, in the West, Christianity has become less important. And even though in many ways Christianity was repressive, in other ways Christianity offered certain ethical codes, and it offered community, it offered the regular practice, regular mass or church services, which were an outlet for people in the community. So with this kind of loss of Christianity or loss of a state religion, in some ways, one could say people were freed of certain ideas or beliefs, but in another way, we lost a lot of those religious festivals. We lost a lot of those spiritual acts of coming together. So we've really kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater. Science, on the other hand, is kind of a continuation of monotheism, in that it offers a model of this is how the world is. And yes, there are new discoveries, and yes, these new discoveries are wonderful, and they can change. Certainly in terms of health and medicine, they can be of great benefit to us. But when it comes to metaphysics and to worldview, it's really kind of put us into the world of the four elements alone, and I'll explain that in a moment. But the world of the four elements is kind of a caged world, a world where we're stuck in the material. The scientific model, except for certain aspects or thinkers in quantum physics, don't believe there is a God or that there is a divine, or the fact that we can't kind of explain it or prove it scientifically means that we're not even going to go there, we're not going to look at it. So that creates a box and a cage in which we are stuck. And we kind of see this malaise in modern Western society of, Christianity is rejected, science seems to be the answer, but still somehow people are not happy. Why are so many people on antidepressants? Why do many people's lives not have meaning? We've got all the comforts, we live a good life, but why are we depressed? And it's my belief that a very big part of this is because we've lost our spiritual connection. We've lost on a mass level, we've lost a sense of what religion and spirituality is, as a shared, communal experience as well. Of course, when there are 200 people in a cathedral singing a hymn, that has a great power. It's very different to, doing also individual spiritual practice. So we've kind of lost let's say our traditional beliefs, and many people are seeking. Many people find spiritual connection through, let's say, Hinduism or through Buddhism or through other religions, and they offer great answers, but it still kind of cuts us off in many ways from the world of our society, or it cuts us off from our own deeper roots in the West. And I think the problem with this is that, and I believe this is kind of a general, let's say, metaphysical principle, is when we believe in something, when we have true belief in something, we manifest it, we create it, we organize our days, our habits, our ethics according to the belief. When we've got a high desire to do something, even if we're very busy, we still find the ways to navigate in order to do certain things that support our values, our beliefs. Now, belief in a sort of spiritual context isn't something you can just sort of make up and say, okay, now I'm going to believe this. now I'm just gonna, I'm gonna change the way I see things, and this is what I'm gonna follow. Because we as human beings, our belief systems, even beyond, let's say, spiritual belief systems, are built up in the womb, in our early infancy, the culture that's around us, that we experience, what our parents and our societies condition us to believe. And I think most of us here were sort of brought up in traditional religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, etc. Even though we might have rejected those religions, or the orthodox expression of those religions. Despite that, even though we might have rejected them now, they still sit very deeply entrenched in us. And that is often, why, people maybe in their 20s, they question their religions, and then maybe when they have children, or when they go through some sort of crisis, they actually return to the faith in which they were brought up. But the solution that I believe to this crisis of belief that we have in the West is the mysteries. In the West, one could say that is the Western mysteries, but of course there are other mystery practices in other religions. But what makes the mysteries different to Orthodox religion of any sort is that the mysteries are about having a direct experience of the divine. And sometimes it's through meditation and prayer, where we just have a knowing of the presence of the divine. And that is those are kind of daily practices we can develop and we can create and cultivate in our lives. But then there are also the big mystery initiations that we have. And that is kind of, I guess, the other end of the scale, where we have some sort of initiation process or some sort of ceremony where we go into trance, be that collectively or individually, and the ego kind of is put aside for a while, and we just have this big, vast experience of the divine that is irrefutable, that is so profound that we can't question it, that it restructures our deep belief systems. And that certainly is the path that I've gone along in my life. Just as an example, having been brought up in a Christian household, not dogmatic at all, but pretty much going to church until the age of about 10. So those beliefs are kind of ingrained. But then as I started questioning, I started doing different practices. At first, more intellectually, studying things like astrology, tarot, etc. But then when I started to work with shamanism and initiations into that opens up a whole other experience. And the beauty of the mysteries, for example, as a proposed way forward in this crisis of belief that we live in the modern world, is that one can experience the mysteries regardless of religion. It's not an Orthodox religion. You can be Christian and experience the mysteries through a Christian lens. And that then opens the way to kind of re-inhabit the Orthodox religion in which you may have been brought up. Of course, one can return, and this is my proposal as well, return to kind of the basics of what we see around us, the basics of the four elements, the basics of nature, and how nature works, and what the forces of nature are. And then of course the cosmic energies, let's say the planets and what they represent, and I'll talk about this in a moment, the 10 heavens, what those 10 heavens, those 10 states of consciousness represent. So in starting to talk about how can we move forward in spirituality in the modern world, a very simple example of this, I believe, is the sun, what the sun represents. And the sun was, of course, always one of the principal archetypes or forces that people observed and understood and worshipped. The other main one, of course, being Mother Earth. Mother Earth is what's around us. Mother Earth is what feeds us. And then we've got the sun, which rises in the morning and sets in the evening. The sun, which brings light, warmth, fertility. The sun, which also brings inspiration. The sun, which is, in our physical world, the purest expression of, or the clearest expression of, divine light. So the sun becomes a symbol and a metaphor for the celestial light, for the celestial aspect of the divine, for example. And then, of course, Mother Earth, being physical, is our grounding here in this world, and our physical bodies are directly connected to the earth. When we eat, we're taking the earth in, it's feeding our earth, our body, and we're having a relationship, an experience on this stage of earth, of physical creation. So, the earth mother and the sun god or goddess, in Japan, for example, Amaterasu is the sun goddess. For the Greeks, it's Helios or Apollo. So these are two very tangible bodies, cosmic bodies, that we can experience, that we can see, that we can interact with, and that are kind of there, irrefutable. They are physical, but they're also divine. They also tell a story. The Mother Earth is the story of fertility, and how nature works provides metaphors for life. The seasons, for example. And then, of course, the seasons are also determined by the sun. And that then brings us back to the mysteries. The sun isn't only about the light. One of the big questions that the ancients asked, especially the Egyptians, was what happens to the sun in the form of Ra when it's night, when he goes into the darkness, when he goes into the underworld? What happens there? And then how does he come back? He comes back in the morning or in spring. The morning and spring are correspondences in the story of rebirth. The sun grows, and then he starts to have a descent. His light grows weaker until he goes into the underworld, into the darkness, only to be reborn the next day. That is the story of Ra, that is the story of Osiris, that is the story of Christ. This journey of the sun, the light, going through these different phases, and what those phases mean. And of course, most importantly, that is always the hope of rebirth. So the monotheistic religions, for example, developed later, and we'll go through a little bit of sort of the history of religious consciousness in the next lesson. Originally, there were the polytheistic religions with many gods, and then the monotheistic religions kind of developed out of those, where certain prophets said, of all these gods, this is the true God. In the case of Judaism, it was like, of all the ancient pantheon of Canaan, Yahweh is the true God, or the only one, or this is the God that we pledge ourselves to, and this is the God that we follow, for example. The same is true in Islam, where the Prophet Muhammad sort of said, of all the gods that have been in existence, Allah is the one, and these are the laws that we are going to follow accordingly. So the monotheistic religions kind of took gods out of the pantheon and kind of conflated them with kind of an all-seeing consciousness, a monotheistic consciousness. And the idea of monotheism, of course, is that you're born, you live your life, and then you die, and then hopefully you go to heaven or to the afterworld. And that kind of creates a very linear experience of the world. Again, it kind of puts us into this box of physicality. And a more pagan or season-based or nature-based observation of this journey is, of course, that every spring we are reborn. And a few people in the Netherlands today mentioned that the sun's shining and it's warmer, and that just makes one feel better after a long winter, for example. And that is the experience that people had with this rebirth experience, and that is what we strive for, to find the ways to be reborn, to be rejuvenated, to see without the filters of our conditioning, so that we can we can feel youthful and light and happy again in our lives, and to approach life with more of that light of the reborn sun, as opposed to kind of living in the stagnation of who we have been as humans. So I'm going to very briefly, because we're going to go into this in future lessons, I'm going to very briefly look at this model of the 10 heavens. And as I said before, this relates to sort of Ptolemaic speculation, and Dante Alighieri also alludes to this. So the basic idea is that this is the disk of the world. And that's not to say I believe that the world is flat, but metaphorically speaking, this world from our geocentric experience is flat. And we live in this world of the 4 elements. We are bound by the 4 elements. This is our stage. The 4 elements, of course, are earth, water, air, and fire. And each one of those have a relationship to different aspects of life and of self. So the element of earth is the most physical. The element of earth is the physical body. It relates to our stability. It relates to money and, the things that we do in the physical world. The element of water is the water in the body. So one could say the earth element is our bones, it's our flesh. The element of water is the waters of our body. And of course, we are made up of about 80% water. But it's not only the water in the physical body, it's also the waters of our emotions. It relates to our emotional life. It's the flow of emotions, the fluidity of emotions. Then we have the element of air, which is here like the clouds. The element of air is our breath. It's our mind, our intellect, and it's kind of the abstract. The elements of water and earth are tangible. It's physically seen in our body. But of course, we experience air through our lungs and through our pores that breathe. So air is about that communication. It's that medium of communication. It's the mind that we can't see, but that can make things concrete. We can have a thought, and then we can put it into manifestation through our bodies, through interacting with this earth realm. And then we've got the element of fire, which is our aura, you could say. It's also our heat, the heat in our body. Even though we're made up of earth and water physically, we're also somehow hot. So we've got this heat, this fire that emanates. And that is our passion, that is our action in the world, that is our doing, that is our movement. And fire, of course, also relates to the alchemy, the transmutation that takes place through fire. So we as humans have these 4 elements, earth, water, air, fire, very literally in our bodies. And again, I'm going to talk about this more with the breathwork, because it's very important in terms of the breathwork process as well. Of course, the breath is our air. The air of our breath, just through breathing it, changes our mind. It changes our brain frequency when we do this conscious breathing. So, and as humans, our air, our head, our mind is so important, because we conceptualize ideas and then we put into creation and into fruition. So when we, again, one can take this symbolism very far. When we are too much in our heads, and which is a tendency in the modern West, when we're too much in our heads, we tend to do less in the world out there. We use our hands and our bodies less. So maybe we feel sometimes disconnected or dissatisfied because we're not interacting with earth. Obviously, computers and phones exacerbate this. So we are made up of these 4 elements, literally in our body. They're in our bodies, let's say symbolically. Of course, we are not fire within, but we have a fieriness. So these 4 elements make up the cross, the cross of the 4 elements. And the symbolism of the crucified Christ, for example, is the symbolism of us as a soul, as represented by Christ on the cross, transcending the 4 elements, being resurrected from the coffin that the 4 elements could represent. If we as humans are practical earth, and we live our emotions and get stuck in our emotions, water. We get stuck in our heads, air. And we are fiery, we do actions in the world, but we don't have a greater meaning. We don't speculate on what is God or have godly experiences. We are stuck in this cross or this coffin of the four elements. So that symbolism of the crucifixion represents being resurrected out of that coffin, so that we can find new life, so that we can be reborn, so that we can live lives where we're not tied up, where we can actually be free and become magicians. And the symbolism of the magician card in the major arcana of the tarot is the magician, one arm up, one arm down, which represents as above, so below. So that reminds us that we are aspects of the divine, acting as gods in our world, acting as magicians in our world, as opposed to the world dictating to us what is. And so that Christ on the cross, which it's incidentally, there are images of Dionysos on a cross going back to pre-Christian times, but that imagery of the crucified person then is the fifth element, where the soul takes precedence. Let's say, again, just using the story of Christ, that godliness of Christ was so much more powerful than the hold of the four elements, that Christ could be resurrected. He could return from a dead body, and he could reanimate that dead body. Of course, that's symbolic and metaphorical, but that is the promise that rebirth holds. And of course, to be able to be reborn, you have to undergo the mysteries. You have to know God and the divine so profoundly that your faith and belief takes you beyond the limitations of those four elements. So in terms of this model, we've also got this egg, this cosmic egg, which is the three worlds, which we'll look at and experience a little bit later with a cosmic tree breathwork. So this is our normal experience here in the world. And then this section here is below, that's the underworld. And the underworld is, in terms of the hero's journey, in terms of our personal soul journey, that is the place of the unknown that we go into when we seek growth. When we truly seek growth, especially spiritual growth or wisdom, we need to go into the unknown. We need to face certain dangers, and those might just be dangers to the ego or dangers to the ego's perspective of the world. We challenge the ego's old perspective of the world. So we face the unknown, we go into the underworld in order to gain new knowledge. And in theory, it's very easy. It's like, oh yes, I want to change my mind, I want to see things differently. But in practice, that's not how it works. And I've worked with people, with transformation, with deep psychological process for 30 years, and we all want to change in our heads. We all want transformation, but there is a price to transformation. The end result is always very good. It's always beautiful. We come out freer and lighter, but the price we have to pay is to let go of our old familiarities, our old habits, our old comfort zones. And to break a comfort zone is really difficult. Again, the head might say, yes, I want to change my comfort zone, but when you have to really give up that thing that holds you in a place, it's not that easy. And therefore initiation isn't about facing your biggest fear or facing the demon or whatever. It's about actually being humble with ourselves, humble before the divine, to say, I'm actually going to let go of this habit. I'm going to let go of this thing that I know is not good for me, or good for my life, or good for those around me. I'm going to let go of this so that I can become a better person. That's on a psychological level. But of course, there's also spiritual initiation, where we have epiphanies, where we have revelations, where we see so much that there is so much more than what we have been taught to believe before. So that's the realm of initiation. and then we go into the heavenly realms above. So that's the underworld, is the roots of the tree that we're going to work with later in our breath work. The middle realm, the 4 elements, is our physical body and our physical world. And then we go into the 7 heavens, which is the first step. And each one of these heavens, of course, have a meaning. But we've got, the heaven of the moon, which is the sublunary world, which is our instincts. We've got the heaven of Mercury, Hermes, which is about our communication. It's got a mental aspect to it, but it also relates to the divinity of Hermes. Then we've got Venus, which is the goddess of love, but that also relates to sort of love in the world, beauty around us, learning to live in paradise. Again, there's so much more to it. I'm just going through it very briefly. And then we've got the realm of the sun, which is the 4th heaven. And this is the geocentric model, which is the old model. Geocentric means with the earth as the center. Nowadays, in modern science, the heliocentric model is what's used, whereby the sun is the center of the solar system and the planets revolve around that. And even though they seem contradictory, they're not. Even though we on earth sort of are beholden to the sun, or we revolve around the sun, still contextually here on earth we are still the center of our relative universe. So in the geocentric model, the order is just flipped. If this were the sun, then the earth would be here, but because we're going with the geocentric model, we flip that. So the sun is the 4th heaven, and that of course is our ego, that is our connection to light, it's the element, it's the metal of gold. All of these heavens relate to different metals, and that is also the place of transformation. As you can see, as we go up, this is the Empyrean here. This is God the divine, the impersonal God, the God beyond the personal experience. Within this cosmic egg, this is the personal experience of godliness, of the divine, of nature, etc. This light here represents God beyond, the great spirit that is the kind of impersonal mover of the entire universe. That light is then stepped down, and within our experience it was best expressed as the sun. But this light isn't only an external light, it's also the light that we learn to integrate, and the light that we discover in new ways in the underworld, in the unknown. That's the inner light that we find. And of course that connects back to the God above is also the God below. As above, so below. So that is this personal axis. This is our soul axis within these different spheres and heavens. So then beyond the sun, which is so rich in its symbolism, of course, the sun is about the rebirth. The sun is about illumination, epiphany, where we have an experience where we just see in different ways. And of course, most religious books talk about prophets who have these epiphanies and these understandings and revelations. And then beyond this realm of the sun, we go into Mars, the planet Mars, Jupiter and Saturn. And these planets, these levels relate to different metals, which relate to alchemy as well, which we'll look at through the course of this process. And then we get to this black band here, which relates to the fixed stars. And that is the zodiac, that is astrology. And the fixed stars, one could say, is almost like our fate, our destiny. What is written in the stars, what astrology dictates, or what forces out there dictate. So that is the role of astrology on one hand, and understanding our astrology. But then when we go beyond that into this white band, that is the primum mobile, which means the prime mover. That's almost like the highest god, goddess, step down to the next level that causes the physical and the personal universe to move. This Godhead here is beyond personal experience. this prima mobile steps that down, where it becomes something moved by something bigger. And as we get to know these planets and spheres, in becoming magicians, we can learn to move those energies through our consciousness and through our awareness. But until we learn to become magicians, we are moved by these forces. So if we can learn to understand and go beyond the fixed star level, we become the writers of our own script. We become something beyond what is dictated by this world down here. And then we can achieve our own personal Godhead. Again, that takes us into the Empyrean here, which is the Godhead beyond. So this is a basic scheme of our being in many senses. And that is the scheme that I kind of propose as a way forward of understanding our place as spiritual beings within our own world, within our universe, and as a way to start creating our own spirituality. And some of the ways of living our spirituality, and as I said before, this course really is about having practices and developing the practices, is through the acts of faith. And those acts of faith range from daily meditation and prayer practice to the big ceremonies, the big celebrations we do in community. And then of course things like pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is one of the best ways that we kind of demonstrate our faith. It's literally learning to walk as a new person. Again, it's a hero's journey. We learn to walk as a new person in the world. And we are of course heading to a destination that holds meaning for us, that our belief system prioritizes or gives importance to. So we walk towards that. We walk through our limitations, our fears, our comfort zones, in order to get to this holy city or this holy place that represents us sort of transcending or going beyond or being reborn. So that story of pilgrimage is also very much the same as that story of the rebirth that comes every morning and every spring with the return of the sun. And just as an illustration of one of those acts of faith, one of the important things that personally I'm going to be doing, and Jeroen and some other people will be doing, is a walk to Rome again. And we're going to start our journey from Amsterdam, which is a very interesting city, of course, because it is kind of one of the capitals of alchemy, and Amsterdam itself is kind of built below water. It's fully kind of constructed by human ingenuity. So we're starting with that, and then we're going to be doing this process through the Alps, which in my belief is very similar perhaps to the Himalayas, perhaps in the consciousness of ancient peoples. Those mountains, those high mountains, those places of beauty represent a world that is closer to the world of the gods and goddesses. And then from there we'll be going all the way to Rome, walking to Rome. And Rome represents the sun in many senses. Rome hasn't only been the center of the Christian world, but Rome has been the center of the Mediterranean world for a few thousand years. And what that represents is the sun, the coming together. And it is my belief that Rome wasn't just kind of randomly an important city in the ancient world just because it was built close to the Tiber river and along trade routes. It's more that something in the land there already holds such an incredible power, and people were naturally attracted to it, and people then built this city on it, and that helped magnify that energy, which turned Rome into an empire. And then from the empire it turned into the center of the Christian world. So Rome in itself holds an incredible power, and no doubt Rome is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, and it still holds that sacred energy whether one is Christian or not. So we will now go into the breathing. I will explain and I'll explain the model of breathing we're going to follow. and we are going to do a seated breathwork, but it's quite an intense one. So I think it's a good idea to either sit on your bed against the bed head, or to sit on a couch sort of in the middle of the couch that you've got space around you. I certainly don't think you're going to fall over, but if you do fall over, you just want to fall into pillows. So do prepare your space. I also suggest that you connect your device to an external speaker via Bluetooth or whatever, just so that the sound perhaps is a little bit louder, so you can have a little bit more of an expansive sound experience.